I want to welcome you all to the Faculty Distinguished Lecturer, with special thanks to the Grace A. Tanner Center for their support for this. And I am so pleased this morning to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Chris Phillips to you, and hope that you are as excited as I am to hear his paper entitled Reason in Enlightenment Europe, What Margaret Cavendish Can Teach Us About Higher Education Today. Dr. Chris Phillips is an associate professor of philosophy. Originally from Michigan, he earned his bachelor's in philosophy from Central Michigan University, a master's in philosophy from Western Michigan University, and finally left the state and got his PhD in philosophy from the University of Iowa, something that he and I have in common, although not in philosophy and definitely not at the same time. He joined the faculty here at SUU in 2014 and has been influential in growing the philosophy major and providing amazing courses for his students. He is a trained modernist with research interests in Descartes, Margaret Cavendish, Mary Shepard, the philosophy of education, and pre-college philosophy. He's the co-founder of the Utah and Iowa Lyceum pre-college philosophy programs and currently serves as associate editor for the journal Precollege Philosophy and Public Practice. I first heard about Margaret Cavendish through a book called Sociable Letters, which focused on letters Cavendish wrote to a number of people on topics like marriage, medicine, war, science. Before I met Chris, I knew exactly one person with whom I could talk about Margaret Cavendish. After today, I have the feeling that many more of us will be able to engage in that conversation. Dr. Phillips' talk today is on the philosophical scholarship on Enlightenment Europe that largely focuses on the role of scientific reasoning. As a consequence, scholars bind philosophy and science tightly together and emphasize the way rationality led to the development of modern science. Margaret Cavendish provides an example of a thinker who was not only engaged in the scientific enterprises of her day, but also included disciplines we today lovingly call the humanities. Cavendish provides us an opportunity to reevaluate the narrowly scientific conception of reason during the 17th and 18th centuries, as well as our current outlook on education. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Phillips.
All right. Thank you all for being here. There are a couple other folks I'd like to thank. First, thank you, Dean Breen. You make me sound so impressive. I'd also like to thank an old friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Seth Jones. He and I have been working on a paper for a couple of years from which I've adapted this lecture. So without him, this talk really wouldn't exist. Some other folks I'd like to thank for helpful feedback on this are my colleagues in the philosophy program, Professor Fitzpatrick and Professor Ellefson. I'd also like to thank my dad, who read through and gave me comments on an earlier draft of the paper. And I'd like to thank my partner, Cassie Finley. Thank you so much for everything, for all of your support. So, as Dean Breen said, this paper is about Margaret Cavendish and higher education today. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the things we're gonna cover, give you a kind of a layout of how the talk is gonna go. I want to talk a little bit about higher education today, the lay of the land, how I see it playing out. I'd like to introduce Margaret Cavendish, tell you kind of who she was and why she's worth talking about. And then I'd like to kind of circle back and talk a little bit about what I'm calling the received narrative in early modern scholarship or Enlightenment European scholarship in philosophy. It's this sort of narrative of how science and rationality developed. And I'd like to kind of motivate and try to explain why this might have happened. I'm not coming out here trying to say that all of my colleagues in philosophy are making an obvious mistake. I just think that they are making a mistake, every one of them. And in order to do that, we'll talk a little bit about Descartes. I have a soft spot for Descartes myself, and so we'll just look at some of the things that he has to say, because he's a foundational figure in this narrative. Then we'll turn our attention back to Cavendish and how looking at her and incorporating her into how we think and talk about Enlightenment scholarship can help us reconceptualize what was going on in Enlightenment Europe, and then we'll conclude by drawing that back to the discussion about higher education today. So let's jump in. Universities around the country have in the last roughly 80 to 100 years shifted their focus from the traditional liberal arts curriculum to an increasingly practical or vocational form of education. There's a feeling, I would say not necessarily among professors and administrators at universities, but among the general public, that the purpose of higher education is, at least in some form, job training. A cursory Google search will produce a huge number of articles asking whether college is a sound investment, or whether college graduates make more money than their peers who elect to forego college for work. And sure, it's true, college graduates tend to make more money, but I think that it's a mistake to define college purely in terms, or in economic terms. There's little room to argue that in every modern liberal democracy, making money is a practical necessity. Yet, I think there's something deeply confused about taking the value of education generally and higher education specifically to be exhausted by economic gains one can get from having an education. I've argued elsewhere in some of my published works, got to be self-serving in some respect here, that conflating practicality of an education with vocationality is a conceptual confusion. So I'm not going to get into that here. You can check it out later. Instead, I want to discuss a related problem that I think is present in the way we conceive of the nature, purpose, and value of higher education. Following the 2008 recession, there was a marked shift in the priorities of students and educators alike towards STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The causes for the shift are probably diverse and complicated, so I'm not going to speculate or offer an oversimplified explanation just to advance what I'm trying to convince you of. Instead, I'll just lean on the fact that people seem to see STEM fields as practical and leading to a professional end, right? Scientists, engineers, folks in tech, they tend to make more money. That's a good thing. People want that in a precarious economic environment, so that's what we focus on. Okay. And we can see this, I think, in every aspect of the university, including our own university. Not to put anybody on blast, but consider our own mission statement. Southern Utah University is a dynamic teaching and learning community that engages in experiential education leading to personal growth, civic responsibility, and I'm emphasizing here, professional excellence. In addition to the traditional elements of higher education, which stress the development of students, and I would hope faculty alike, as persons, as citizens, our mission stresses the goal of obtaining a job, a profession. I mentioned already that conceiving of higher education purely as a means to a job is a mistake, I think. And I don't mean to accuse our university of doing that, right? I mean, they didn't eliminate the other two aspects here. So I'm not saying that. Still, it's striking that professional excellence is given perhaps equal weight to these other sort of more abstract goals. I think there are two ways, probably more, to interpret how this made its way into our mission. The first, I think, is that probably legislators and other decision makers feel the pressure from outside of academia to vocationalize higher education. And rather than pushing back and trying to educate the public, because that's difficult, unless you can get them to campus, it's really hard, folks have just kind of built in the neoliberal pressure and shifted the focus of education from the more abstract civic responsibility to the easily understandable and measurable aims of employability. I'm afraid that's probably how it actually ended up in the mission. But I prefer a second way to think about what that means. Okay? I understand understand the second interpretation as one that encompasses the other two stated aims of the university while respecting the need for education. As a philosopher, I spend way too much time thinking about the words we use and the concepts to which they refer. And all of my students out there, you know exactly how obsessive I get about this. I can see a few people nodding. Thank you. I was recently invited to deliver a guest lecture on engineering ethics to an engineering capstone class. In preparing for that lecture, I did some research into the nature of professional ethics generally. This led me to think about what is a profession and why it's important that certain professions have standards and ethical guidelines by which their practitioners must follow. The word profession itself is derived from the late Latin term professus, which roughly means to profess a vow. We might wonder what that has to do with a profession as we conceive of it today, right? Profession's a job. What's the connection here? Well, the answer is surprisingly straightforward. In the monastic tradition, monks used to have to profess to the public that in light of their specialized training, they would live according to a higher standard. They would follow this calling that they have. And it was a public declaration that they were going to commit to living a more just, ethical life. Thus, they would profess their commitment to live to a higher standard. And such professions bled over into highly skilled and specialized trades. So you can see how this would tie in with engineering, I hope. As jobs require increasingly specific training, it became increasingly important that people who took on those skilled positions professed to self-govern because no one else could check on them. They have very specialized skills. It's not difficult to see how we can take this idea of professionalism and apply it to higher education today. Okay. Let's take the example that I should have hit that one before, sorry. Let's take the example of our engineering students. This is obviously a photo of what engineers look like. Again, this is a quick Google search that just produced. That's an engineer, I guess. Let's look at them. Within the field of engineering, there are different fields of subspecialization, as seems to be the case with much of our training. The result of that specialized training is that there's an incredibly small number of people who are actually capable of understanding what one another are up to. Professional peers, the set of professional peers becomes vanishingly small. The fact that students in an engineering capstone, as I learned very recently, already have a very hard time talking to one another within their specializations just highlights the need that we instill ethics early on in the curriculum. The problems become more acute as they enter the profession itself, as the number of engineers who have the specific knowledge necessary to evaluate the choices made by any given engineer is so small, we have to rely on them to check themselves before they wreck themselves. Engineering is a profession, and as such, we need engineers who profess to live and work according to a higher standard. In light of this understanding of the nature of professionalism, I propose that universities in general, and ours specifically, insist upon an increased emphasis in the humanities and artistic fields as well. Those fields whose value is less directly tied to vocational or professional ends, but are more easily connected to character development, personal development, and civic responsibility. Fields like philosophy, English, art, and music, among many, many others, are just as valuable as more professionally oriented fields, even to those fields themselves. According to a recent report by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, from which I got this, which it might be a little bit difficult to see, I apologize for that. Many institutions were ill-prepared to handle the influx of students looking for STEM degrees following the 2008 recession. But they're also predicting that the COVID pandemic is likely to cause another STEM surge. In fact, what this is telling us is that most jobs are going to be within STEM fields within the next 10 to 15 years. Without question, the predicted STEM surge is an opportunity for my colleagues in STEM fields and for universities generally to help produce the next wave of professionals. The problem, however, is that both within and without higher education, many people have far too narrow of the purpose and value of education. This is what I've been trying to get across here. I'm afraid that too many people see STEM as merely a means to an economic end, study STEM fields, get a good job, right? I mean, it makes sense. But the mere having of a job is not an end unto itself. Ultimately, we probably want gainful employment because it provides us a means to survive and ideally thrive. Right? We want to do things that we actually want to do. We all want to live well, but often we don't really consider what that means or what that takes. We prefer expediency and easy answers to careful reflection and challenging questions. That natural tendency, I think, has bled over into the STEM push. The end for the sake of which one pursues STEM ought not be mere financial stability, though that could be one of your goals. It should be for the love of knowledge and for the betterment of human lives. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering, like, isn't this supposed to be a talk about the Enlightenment? Well, like today, the Enlightenment was a time of tremendous scientific growth. And it's tempting to study only scientific developments, both in the Enlightenment and today. Throughout the past 50 years or so, the vast majority of scholarship on Enlightenment philosophy has focused on the history and philosophy of science. Well, that's a very important theme in the Enlightenment. I think it's too narrow of a focus. Here, I want to present Margaret Cavendish as a case study in why it's wrong to focus on science as an end in itself. She's a compelling figure who engaged in the scientific and philosophical discussions of her day, but also included within her purview the humanities fields, humanistic fields like poetry, literature, art, and music. Cavendish furnishes us with a much richer notion of reason than the narrowly scientific approach found in much of the literature that's discussed about the Enlightenment. Her work forces us to recognize the lack of sharp boundaries between the sciences and the humanities in her time and can provide us compelling reason to reject those boundaries today as well. In discussing her work, I'm going to make a case for why it's important that we expand our goals, both as individuals and as institutions of higher learning, beyond narrowly prescribed vocational aims. I'll consider the end for the sake of which we pursue professional excellence, to live better, more fulfilled, and more ethical lives. The way we do this is to return to a more well-rounded form of education, one which sees education not merely as a means to an economically stable, maybe epic also, but also to a life well lived. So let's before we delve into Cavendish's philosophy, let's figure out who she was. Why am I talking about Cavendish herself? As Dean Breen mentioned, not many people talk about her. So why should we? Well, Margaret Cavendish was born Margaret Lucas in 1623 in England. She was born into a royalist family, and if you're familiar with 17th century England, it's a tumultuous time to be a royalist. As a result of her royalist family, or her royalist ties, she had to live in exile in Paris and Antwerp for around 20 years after King Charles I was deposed. She served on the court of Queen Henrietta Maria and met William Cavendish, which is how she became Margaret Cavendish, married him, and became the Duchess of Newcastle. At the time, women were typically not taken seriously as scholars and were, broadly speaking, not afforded much access to education. Cavendish had tutors as a child and was tremendously ambitious, desiring to be famous for her writing, but didn't really enjoy the sort of formal education of her male counterparts. Nevertheless, William Cavendish encouraged Margaret to develop her philosophical and literary career. Using his considerable scholarly connections, he bolstered her development. Through the Cavendish circle, she had direct access to, but for reasons of decorum, likely did not really interact with, folks like Thomas Hobbes, René Descartes, Marin Mersenne, Walter Charlton, and so many others. Truly incredible. Despite her lack of formal training, she was still a prolific writer, publishing some 21 books during her lifetime. 21! It's amazing. That included collections of plays, poetry, orations, novels, philosophical works, and what we would today consider scientific texts. Of particular interest to my project today are works where she seems to blend natural philosophy, as what they called science at the time, and fiction. One work in particular, The Blazing World, to which I'll return below, is seen as one of the pioneering works of science fiction. And she appended it sort of as, it was an appendix to her scientific work, Observations Upon Experimental Philosophy. The latter, a work fiercely critical of mechanistic explanation and the unmitigated excitement scientists at the time, such as Power, Hooke, and Boyle had for microscopes and telescopes and air pumps and all the other cool stuff that scientists were working with, is receiving scholarly attention in the philosophical community today. Quite a bit of it, in fact. Yet at the time, it was not at all well received. She was and is sometimes still referred to as Mad Madge. So you can see over here. That should get a bigger laugh. That's hilarious. Despite the almost universally negative reception of her work, she was still invited, again, probably because she was part of the Cavendish circle, probably because she was the Duchess of Newcastle. She was the first woman invited to join England's Royal Society, and it was something of a spectacle. It didn't go especially well, and they didn't invite her back, as you can see. Okay. So let's turn our attention briefly to what I'm calling the received narrative. Early modern philosophy, Enlightenment philosophy, I'm going to talk about them interchangeably. Let's talk about what the received narrative is in contemporary scholarship in modern philosophy. The many important challenges in our in our knowledge of the world and the methods for gaining that knowledge that occurred during the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe are exceedingly well known. Among the most significant advancements were the beginnings of modern science that grew out of natural philosophers' empirical investigation into the world. And the new tools, which we just mentioned, microscopes, telescopes, air pumps, and so forth, that allowed these philosophers to pursue novel avenues of investigation. The incredible impact of the sciences on our world today has led to a narrative in Enlightenment scholarship that emphasizes the connection between the sciences and philosophy, and in particular, the important role that reason, narrowly conceived, plays in gaining our knowledge of the world. The ubiquity of this narrative can be seen even in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on the Enlightenment. I apologize for the length of this quote, but it's really, I think, incredibly telling. William Bristow says, "In this era dedicated to human progress, the advancement of the natural sciences is regarded as the main exemplification of and fuel for such progress. Isaac Newton's epochal accomplishment was a great stimulus to the intellectual activity of the 18th century and served as a model and inspiration for the researches of a number of Enlightenment thinkers. Newton's system strongly encourages the Enlightenment conception of nature as an orderly domain governed by strict mathematical dynamical laws, and the conception of ourselves as capable of knowing those laws and of plumbing the secrets of nature through the exercise of our unaided faculties. The conception of nature and how we know it changes significantly with the rise of modern science. It belongs centrally to the agenda of Enlightenment philosophy to contribute to the new knowledge of nature and provide a metaphysical framework within which to place and interpret this new knowledge." So as you can see, even philosophers today are saying explicitly, science is the driving force. This is what changed everything in the Enlightenment. This was it, the end-all, be-all. And while there's much that's correct in that story, which is seen especially in scholarship on such canonical figures as Galileo, Newton, Leibniz, and Hume, it underplays and I think misrepresents the important role of what we're calling today the humanities. And correspondingly, seemingly non-rational states like fancy, which is roughly what we'd think of today as imagination, the imagination, the capacity for mental images, and emotions, which are more typically seen as within their purview. Indeed, the traditional reading of the time period has led scholars to downplay or ignore the important role even these canonical figures held for those seemingly non-rational states. The focus on a conception of reason antithetical to those states, so again, imagination, fiction, this kind of thing, emotions, has led to a loss, to a great extent, of the essential humanistic character of philosophy, especially regarding the good life. That the history of philosophy is necessarily the history of science, which, by the way, I took from a call for papers They actually said that the history of philosophy is the history of science, and vice versa. That the history of philosophy is necessarily the history of science is a result of a fundamental misreading, I think, of the development of philosophical discussions at the time. But if we include the actual broad diversity of folks in the Enlightenment canon, we can see that the philosophical discussions went far beyond the narrow scope of science given in the scholarship today. Perhaps most baldly stated in Lisa Shapiro's 2016 essay, Revisiting the Early Modern Canon, there's been a shift in recent years to refocus the central problems in Enlightenment philosophy as not so much based on science, but based on human freedom, the nature of education, relevant to our discussion today, and autonomy. Cavendish's writings allow us to demonstrate the lack of sharp boundaries between the sciences and the humanities and the philosophical systems of the Enlightenment. Including Cavendish in our scholarly canon can help to overcome this received narrative of the Enlightenment as an idealized, hyper-rationalist, purely scientific approach to philosophy in the 17th and 18th centuries. This, in turn, allows us to show the important role philosophy played, and continues to play, as a bridge between the sciences and what we think of as the humanities, as we work to build a new narrative in Enlightenment scholarship and a richer, more inclusive conception of reason. All of this, of course, is a microcosm of the problem I raised at the opening of this lecture. Academics look at Enlightenment Europe much the same way many of us look at education today, as entirely driven by science without further end. It's worth taking a moment, though, again, as I said, to kind of elaborate on and motivate why it is that this received narrative is so widely accepted. There's little doubt that the way that a lot of early modern philosophy classes are taught contributes to this. The canon and its convenient story of rationalism, opposing empiricism, giving rise to a synthesis in Kant or something, has long enjoyed its pride of place in modern survey courses. It's the way I was taught modern philosophy, and I don't do that anymore, but it's still there, it's entrenched. The story is perhaps the most familiar part of this received narrative that I'm talking about, which is the view that the development of philosophy in the modern period was singularly driven by and primarily focused on developments within science and math. Each of these folks play into that explicitly. Shapiro, who I just mentioned, suggests that this trend in philosophical pedagogy and scholarship is in no small part driven by contemporary trends in philosophy generally. She says, much of contemporary philosophy of science has moved away from general concerns about scientific explanation and towards philosophies of specialized sciences, including, of course, the philosophy of physics. Contemporary debates about the nature of space find their antecedents in early modern debates, as do contemporary discussions of the laws of nature and of causation. The reconfigured canon thus continues to play its justificatory role with regard to contemporary philosophical interests. So Leibniz and Newton famously debated about the nature of space and time. Berkeley was a relativist about space and time. Hume, of course, challenged our notion of causation. And again, these are the things that we teach our students because they all kind of tie back in with physics, because that's what drove the story. What Shapiro said, though, strikes me as essentially correct, but remains an incomplete statement of the broader problem. I speculate that part of the increased interest in the philosophy of science and the more narrowly associated fields like the philosophy of biology and the philosophy of physics is in part an attempt by philosophers to try to stay relevant given the STEM push. Whatever the causal story of this shift to seeing the history of philosophy as the history of science, it's clear that this interpretation is present in both contemporary philosophy's pedagogy and scholarship, the way we teach it and the way we write about it. While I argue that there's good reason to find this narrative incomplete, it's nevertheless, as I mentioned before, worth taking a moment to see why it is that this developed in the first place. It's not as if it's entirely out of line. So let's take a look at our old friend Descartes. Descartes, pictured here at the court of Queen Christina. And if you look closely, you can also see Bernie Sanders hanging out with him there. Descartes provides us a jumping off point for the story. And he typically is understood to be exactly that, the sea change between the late medieval and early modern. His advances in mechanistic explanation, mathematics, and astronomy all had reverberations throughout the history of science. That he sought to ground his science in a firm, unshakable foundation is an ineliminable part of the narrative as well. And that too is well-founded, but ultimately incomplete. The vast majority of undergraduate students who study philosophy will read Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, and probably only the Meditations. And it's there that we get this hyper-rationalist, very sciencey interpretation, and it makes its strongest showing. So the story goes, Descartes begins with a priori principles, that is, things that don't require any sort of observation or anything, they're just knowable conceptual truths, and supposedly spin out the remainder of the known universe using only mathematics and self-knowledge. I mean, it's a cool story, but it's not true. It's difficult not to overstate the commitment to a priori reasoning and what he calls metaphysical certainty, so beliefs that it's impossible to doubt. Moreover, it's only in passing in two other pieces, the Discourse on Method and the Principles in Philosophy, that he even mentions that there's another form of certainty, which he calls moral certainty, that's suited to our day-to-day pursuits. It's definitely not a central point in Descartes' writings, but that doesn't mean it's unimportant. Most of our day-to-day reasoning doesn't really involve conceptual physics, at least not as such. Now, to be sure, Descartes was a critic of inductive reasoning, and he hoped to preserve geometric certainty in everything that he was doing, in physics and metaphysics. But often, the Cartesian project of how we're supposed to live gets swept under the rug. This hyper-rationalist, science-focused reading of Descartes is bolstered by the sort of statements we find in introductions to modern textbooks. Here are two of them. Again, I apologize for the size here. One collection reads, "The second focus of this volume is the philosophical and scientific method. The topic was extremely important to early modern philosophers because of their rejection of scholastic philosophy. The dominant philosophy of the Middle Ages was accompanied by ideas of new ways of doing philosophy and science." Right? So again, we get this scientific thing there. And consider this other one. New scientific and philosophical doctrines had emerged from Galileo, Descartes and his followers, Bacon, Pascal, Hobbes, and countless others. Scholastics had fought back fiercely against the new philosophy and science. They had succeeded in getting Galileo condemned by the Catholic Church in 1633 and putting Descartes' works on the Index of Prohibited Books in 1663. Still, the substantial forms and primary matter of the scholastics were giving way to a new mechanistic world of geometrical bodies, corpuscles, and atoms in motion. With this world came novel mathematical and scientific tools for dealing with the newly conceived entities. So you can see even the way that contemporary scholars are framing the discussion before you even read any of these guys is just, look, they're doing science. Isn't that cool? Look at how sciencey they are. Often these volumes end up expanding the traditional canon that we saw before, those big seven, to include other figures, but they include only overtly scientific figures, situating Descartes' works between Galileo and Francis Bacon's New Organon. And it's true, I mean, again, that the vast majority of the work we have from Descartes concerns natural philosophy. From 1633, right after Galileo's condemnation, until 1637, when he published the Discourse, and 1641, when he published the Meditations, primarily what his correspondence that we have concerned was physics or astronomy. What we have beyond treatises in mechanistic physics, cosmology, and human physiology is principally first philosophy, or metaphysics as we think of it today. And the fact that he didn't seem to write much about ethics, apart from a provisional moral code in the Discourse, which we talked about a little bit before, might lead one to conclude that he didn't really think it was interesting. From that, it's not unreasonable to infer that developments in natural philosophy, mechanics, and optics were the central part, if not the totality, of the Cartesian project. So Descartes then represents kind of a summary of all of the problems that face the way scholars teach and think about the Enlightenment. Consider this famous tree metaphor from the preface to the French edition, 1647, of the Principles of Philosophy. We've got the tree drawn out here. This isn't my drawing. I'm not that good. Thank you. Descartes says, "The whole of philosophy is like a tree. The roots are metaphysics, the trunk is physics, and the branches emerging from the trunk are all the other sciences, which may be reduced to three principal ones, namely medicine, mechanics, and morals. By morals, I understand the highest and most perfect moral system, which presupposes a complete knowledge of the other sciences and is the ultimate level of wisdom. Right? So as we think about this, it's pretty clear. You can see it seems like what he's saying is we got to do science, we got to understand science, science is the end-all be-all. Then we can think about morals or whatever, right? Like that stuff can come later. Since Descartes seems to suggest that metaphysics and physics are the core of all knowledge, and that anything subsequent requires perfect knowledge of these, there seems to be little room to focus on anything else. If we take Descartes to be the, quote, father of modern philosophy, as the received narrative calls him, then passages like this set an explicitly science-focused tone for subsequent interpretations of early modern philosophy. That science focus spills over into scholars' interpretations of other figures as well. In a traditional survey, which I don't teach anymore, sorry to my students who've taken it, you would probably read a little bit of Spinoza, but only a very little bit. Parts 1 and 2 of his book, The Ethics. Parts 1 and 2 concern only metaphysics and physics. So most students are left wondering, why is it called The Ethics? By the same token, undergraduates who are introduced to Leibniz often get little more than the monadology, which leaves many of them wondering why he's included at all. While the monadology certainly gives a clear statement of Leibniz's metaphysics, the focus on the text does not do justice to Leibniz's broad-ranging projects, which included within its purview history, poetry, politics, theology, law, and so much more. Our excitement to place the primacy on the development of science even overestimates the impact that works in physics had on later figures. Consider that quote from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, placing primacy on Newton. Hume is usually taken to be modeling his work on Newton, but recent scholarship by philosophers have argued that he's actually not a Newtonian at all. So it doesn't seem that that's what's driving the discussion. Okay, finally, we'll get back to Cavendish. So that's the idea, okay? That's the sort of going discussion in the literature. Science is driving everything. Science is the end-all, be-all. It's the exciting part, and it always was during the Enlightenment. So let's consider Cavendish. So at this point, I urge modern scholars and teachers to take a step back and reconsider this narrative through the lens of figures like Margaret Cavendish. One common thread in Cavendish's later writings is her epistemic conservatism. Put another way, the ability to admit that we don't know very much. Right? She's very cautious about making knowledge claims. And that stems from her metaphysical system and is best exemplified in her criticism of the experiments by the Royal Society. Remember I said that that didn't go so well. There she worries both about the veracity of experimental results and to the extent that they tell us something accurate about the world, their usefulness toward human ends. Her arguments are grounded in her theories of perception and the nature of mind, and the force with which she presents them makes them impossible to ignore. Her writings make clear, however, the controversial nature of early modern science and experimental philosophy. It's not as if Newton showed up, wrote his book, and everybody just accepted it. There was a lot of controversy. If we were to include folks like Cavendish and other voices that are less attended to in our study of the period, we could begin to see ways in which we might not have arrived at this narrow understanding of reason conceived as being exhausted by the discussion of science. Now, I mentioned that Cavendish tended to talk about how little we could know, but that didn't make her a skeptic. Her criticisms of new science coincide with her view that reason is essential to our exploration of the world, and that the senses alone are insufficient. So in that way, she kind of sounds like Descartes. She says, "Next I say that sense, which is more apt to be deluded than reason, cannot be the ground of reason, no more than art can be the ground of nature. Furthermore, experimental and mechanic philosophy cannot be above the speculative part by reason most experiments have their rise from the speculative, so that the artist or mechanic is but a servant to the student," she says. I'll let you think about that for a second. Her reasoning for these claims, in addition to the familiar concerns we see with the reliability of the senses in other early modern figures, is that we're finite parts of nature who can only interact with things that are nearby, and for whom the interior workings of other parts of nature are necessarily opaque to our senses. Thus, the vast majority of reality is cut off from us. As with Descartes, Cavendish sees reason acting as a corrective for the shortcomings of our senses, but unlike the received narrative version of Descartes, she emphasizes the relatively narrow bounds of reason's capacity to tell us anything about the world. Being finite creatures, our ability to know the world is constrained by our location. Being natural creatures, our ability to know the world is constrained by our location. Oh, sorry, whoops. Is our ability to know is no better and often much worse than other parts of nature, rather. Especially animals, who, unlike Descartes, she thinks have their own form of reason. Descartes thought that animals didn't think. Nevertheless, the best approach is to rely on the interplay between reason and the senses. She says, but reason being above sense is more inspective than sense. And although sense doth many times inform reason, yet reason being more subtle, piercing, and active, doth oftener inform and rectify the senses when they are irregular. And although experimental philosophy is not to be rejected, yet the speculative part is much better. By reason it guides, directs, and governs the experimental. But as knowledge and understanding is more clear, where both the rational and sensitive perception do join, so experimental and speculative philosophy do give the surest informations when they are joined and united together. So the best we can do as finite human creatures is to use the interplay of reason and the senses to help us explore the world while recognizing the limits of each. Focusing on one over the other will doom us to failure. The inclusion of Cavendish, even within this received narrative, could thus serve to enrich the narrative itself. Additionally, her discussion of fancy, or again, as we would call it today, imagination, and her use of fiction can be enlisted in the service of complicating the narrative and thereby reducing or reintroducing humanistic elements into our reading of early modern philosophy. Because Cavendish is explicit about the even relatively modest accomplishments of the cooperation of reason and the senses can achieve, it's here that she opens the door for a more inclusive conception of reason. One which includes fancy as an essential characteristic. I mentioned earlier that she appended her proto-science fiction work, The Blazing World, to her treatise Observations upon Experimental Philosophy. And we might wonder why she did so. Well, fortunately, she tells us. If you wonder that I join a work of fancy to my serious philosophical contemplation, think not that it is out of a disparagement to philosophy, or out of an opinion, as if this noble study were but a fiction of the mind. For though philosophers may err in searching for and inquiring after the causes of natural effects, and many times embrace falsehood for truth, yet this doth not prove that the ground of philosophy is mere fiction, but the error proceeds from different motions of reason. But mistake me not, when I distinguish fancy from reason, I mean not as if fancy were not made by the rational parts of nature, or of matter. But by reason, I understand a rational search and inquiry into the causes of natural effects, and by fancy, a voluntary creation or production of the mind, both being effects, or rather actions of the rational parts of matter, of which, as that is a more profitable and useful study than this, so it is also more laborious and difficult, and requires sometimes the help of fancy to recreate the mind and to withdraw it from more serious contemplations. The most obvious way, that is, that Cavendish thinks that fiction is beneficial in our exploration of the world is that it gives us a break from serious and ponderous philosophizing. The use of reason is laborious. If you've ever taken a philosophy class, you know this. G.E. Moore, yeah, watch out. And fiction acts as a nice respite that can cover the same material in a more pleasing fashion. So too, fiction is more pleasing for the reader and can be an excellent avenue by which to make challenging philosophical discussions available to a wider audience, thereby bringing more diverse voices into the discussion. Were these two features of fancy all that could be said in its favor, that would certainly be enough to make it a worthwhile pursuit. However, I think there's something more going on here. One striking feature of Cavendish's system is the way in which she connects reason and fancy. By treating them as two sides of the same coin, she restrains our ability to make any sharp distinction between the two. Both are legitimate approaches to the same set of questions. Indeed, given the fatigue that accompanies rigorous philosophical or scientific writing, fantastical stories might allow us some insight we might not gain otherwise. Precisely because it's more enjoyable and freer in terms of its approach, right? She also notes that many philosophers, following a strict philosophical methodology, still arrive at false beliefs. Same goes for scientists. So we can't reject an approach to philosophy or science simply because it deals in fiction. It'd be unprincipled and capricious. The potential that fictions and fancies have to bring about deep philosophical insights is just as potent as any other bit of philosophical or scientific writing, at least according to Cavendish. Cavendish thereby makes clear that the humanities play as important a role in shaping and exploring the truths about the world as do the natural sciences. And she did so even in the context of Enlightenment Europe. The marriage of fancy and reason in her mature philosophy belies that narrow conception of rationality through which we standardly view the Enlightenment period, and gives us a view of rationality that goes well beyond that impoverished view that we get when we focus solely on the development of science. Okay. So, what do we do with all of that? What does that tell us, and what should we do? This at last brings us back to the way in which limiting the history of philosophy to the history of science produces a deeply misguided view of the Enlightenment period, and what it can tell us about education today. While the development of the science these sciences during the 17th and 18th centuries is certainly an important history to trace and understand, it is by no means the only discussion we should be having. I mentioned at the outset of this lecture that education in Enlightenment Europe was much broader. It typically included studies in logic, metaphysics, astronomy, arithmetic, geometry, physics, music theory, and rhetoric. Yet today, Enlightenment scholarship seems to focus primarily on math, physics, and astronomy. Despite the fact that the Baroque period co-occurred with the scientific revolution, and the fact that music theory was a core aspect of education, philosophers, among others, have either downplayed or outright ignored the overlap between these developments. It's no mere coincidence that Leibniz's solution to the mind-body problem, that is, how exactly do mind and body interact, and the problem of evil, namely, why exactly is it that evil exists if God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect, is to appeal to harmony, which happens to be a central concept in Baroque music. Enlightenment thinkers are not exhausted by those traditional seven I mentioned at the outset, and even when it comes to those figures, their thinking was not exhausted by scientific reasoning. The 17th and 18th centuries were times during which there was tremendous scientific change, but making that scientific change the focal point of the narrative serves to cut off what's really at issue. In many ways, it can be distressingly easy to forget why we as educators care about the truth. Indeed, there are times when the scholarly debates that we engage one another in become so epicyclical and so narrow that the end for the sake of which we're arguing becomes obscured. Just as many survey students in modern philosophy have no idea why Spinoza called his work the Ethics, we reduce the discussion of the Enlightenment to advancement of science without any sort of intrinsic end. It's just science for the sake of science. And while the advances in science raised interesting and important questions about the world around us, Cavendish reminds us of the often overlooked second part of Descartes' tree of knowledge metaphor, that the end for the sake of which we pursue the natural sciences, the fruit of the tree, are the results gained from our study of morals and maybe medicine. Many scholars, as I pointed out, approvingly cite that first part of the passage from the preface to the French edition of the Principles in support of their narrow scientific interests. But if they keep reading, they would notice that the next paragraph says this: just as it is not the roots or the trunk of a tree from which one gathers fruit, but only the ends of the branches, so the principal benefit of philosophy depends on those parts of it which can only be learned last of all. Okay. The principal value has nothing to do with metaphysics or physics. It's the rest. Descartes, Cavendish, and all the rest seem to consider that the ultimate payoff of our inquiries is not some disembodied system of facts grounded in certainty, the end for the sake of which modern philosophers, and I hope by extension today's educators, pursue the truth is decidedly more Socratic in nature. Following Descartes' complete metaphor, developments in first philosophy give rise to that which matters most, more effective, practical concerns including medicine, morals, and other topics that help us live well. A full picture of the world is not a purely rational, disembodied view through the lens of scientific or geometric certainty. The development of science was not seen then, and I think it's a mistake to think of it now as an end in itself. A full picture involves more than mechanical explanations of matter. In Descartes' case, it involved the substantial union of mind and body from which arise the passions, the senses, and the imagination. Spinoza's substance monism was not a mere attempt at point scoring on the problem of mind-body interaction, but rather it was in service of developing an ethics that reflected the putatively divine nature of reality. After a long day of considering skepticism, Hume drank wine and played pool to help himself from philosophical despair. First philosophy provided the roots, physics the stability, but it was all in service of those disciplines that help us live well. So too, I think the purpose of a university education today is not limited to, nor is it exhausted by professional training. The advances Europeans made during the Enlightenment would not have been possible without the broader context, which involved education in much more than science. Oh, I missed that one. Whoops. I hope that you can see the connection between my discussion of the impact of Cavendish's inclusion in the history of philosophy and what that would mean for the field of philosophy and what we might learn about education today. I set out at the beginning of this lecture by identifying what I think are problems, but more importantly, opportunities that face us in higher ed. As I mentioned, the Bureau of Labor Statistics forecasts yet another STEM surge in the future. There are good reasons to pursue a STEM education. But let us not encourage or support STEM fields at the cost of the humanities or the arts. Even, and perhaps especially during times of tremendous scientific advancement, we need to emphasize well-rounded study. The advances made in Enlightenment Europe were not limited to science, and those scientific advancements probably couldn't have been made without the less attended to developments in music, art, literature, and education. All of those help to advance theology, astronomy, physics, and medicine. We do not need merely technically proficient workers to fill the needs of a consumer economy. Rather, we need professionals in the sense that I laid it out at the beginning. We need to cultivate in our students and in ourselves the love of reason in its broadest scope, and to encourage our students to commit to living a much more just and ethical life. In order to accomplish this, I argue that we see the next STEM push as an opportunity to re-emphasize and re-evaluate our commitment to all of the core values of higher education: personal growth, civic responsibility, and, of course, professional excellence. When we consider professional excellence, though, we have to build into that concept a healthy understanding of and respect for the stable virtues that we can cultivate only through a humanistic or artistic study, in addition to narrow technical training. Thank you.